Hello and welcome to Red Red. Today I want to talk about Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. This is the first novel that Flaubert wrote, and he wrote it in kind of 1850s. I believe it was released around 1857. I also have and am pretty keen to read Salammbô by Flaubert. I don't know anything about it, but I really liked Flaubert's writing style. And so before I jump in talking about Madame Bovary, a couple of things. I am going to spoil this book because there's going to be a little bit of jumping around as to what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it, and I'm also going to read some extracts. But another thing to keep in mind is that at some point I'll try and remember to do like a pop-up just to let you know, but I am also going to spoil some parts in the book Stoner by John Williams, because that's a kind of, I was thinking about that book while I was reading Madame Bovary. The general idea of Madame Bovary, it is a classic husband and wife love story. We start the book not focusing on Madame Bovary. We actually are introduced at first to Charles Bovary, and his sort of very mediocre upbringing that shows you and kind of tells the reader like kind of just gives a dossier and gives a quick Bildungsroman of this character that leads him to the place where at first he's sort of married off to an old widow, and he has this almost weird like under the thumb of this matriarch for a wife who is the first Madame Bovary, and then she passes away. Charles, who is a doctor, meets a rich farmer whose daughter is Emma, who then becomes Emma Bovary. They get married, and then like kind of the classic line of that Madame Bovary says, or Emma Bovary says, that is, on the back of the novel, one of the first things she says out loud is, "Oh, why, dear God, did I marry him?" And so she, basically, the concept between them is that Charles is commonplace, pretty mediocre, but a nice enough chap. Emma is beautiful, but very bored. And so what happens is that in her boredom, she eventually starts to see other men, and she has a few adulterous relationships. Eventually, she kind of gets herself into so much of a pickle, particularly with getting into debt and trying to hide this infidelity from Charles, that she actually ends up committing suicide by swallowing poison, and then she dies. And the end of the book, sort of sandwiched, is again a quick little focus on Charles and some of the men of her life, which I thought, at first I didn't necessarily know why the book started with Charles, but then kind of framing Emma's story in between the two Charles makes a little bit of sense in the introduction. So this edition is translated by Geoffrey Wall, and he has an introduction that's pretty great, where he's just talking about firstly the concept of the husband and the wife, and then he talks about the neighbor, or the character Homais, which a little bit early on I kind of clocked that this character, maybe subconsciously, was a surrogate for Flaubert's own voice. And then the introduction, he also talks about Rodolphe, who is the first man who Emma has a kind of earnest affair with. And in that introduction, he kind of alludes to this idea of, again, despite the kind of rebellious actions that Emma takes to get out of the constrictions or confines of being a wife in bourgeois France, the story is still framed around the men. But yeah, that's kind of general idea and general framing of the story. The conflict, or not the conflict, but my general reading experience, I would say, is that I had a kind of balance between, one, the book feels so brilliantly, precisely written, that I was just like, oh man, I was just eating it up. Like Flaubert's prose, and especially as translated by Wall, is brilliant. And there are some extracts that I want to read. The conflict that I had, of course, Emma is an anti-hero or an anti-heroine. She's not necessarily meant to be someone who you agree with her actions, but or agree with the fact that she had an affair. And again, that's sort of why I'm going to get a little bit into talking about Stoner. But I feel like when you're reading a book where a character has an affair, it's not necessarily important for the author to spend so much time saying, oh, having an affair is good or having an affair is bad, because, you don't need to spend like 5 years writing a book and crafting a tale to talk about that. It's more just about the internal consistency and whether or not you buy why the character had the affair. And I would generally say that the first 150 pages of this book are really brilliant in setting that up. I don't necessarily feel like I was sucked in fully to why or committed to Emma having the affair throughout the middle of the book, especially the affair with Rodolphe. But then by the time it comes around to her having the affair with Leon, who is the first man that she kind of really fell in love with or fell in lust with outside of her relationship, or as an extramarital love, that was by the time where there was enough interesting stuff going on, especially with her kind of nervous ailment or hysteria and also playing on the fact that she was getting into debt, that the book was kind of riveting, and I was able to kind of buy or believe what she was happening as a kind of desperate anti-heroine. I just felt like maybe there was a little bit of a hurdle through the middle of the book where I felt like, I just kept saying, What's wrong with Charles? I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. I know that Charles is boring, but for those who have seen my Instagram and they saw the post of me talking that I read Madame Bovary, my caption was #Justice for Charles, because Charles did nothing wrong, dude, and I love Charles. And there's he's a bit of an idiot, he's a bit of a buffoon, but I'm sorry, Emma, are you that much more interesting? And I was thinking about that. I thought, what kind of gave her the right to think that she was a hero? And the thing that Flaubert does is, the thing that gave her the right to be the hero is all of the books that she has read. And, it talks in early on about her having read like all of these romance books, and she tried to read like Balzac and Sand, but kind of didn't really get it. And so Emma still has this very kind of picturesque idea of thinking, almost sort of like a princess, of thinking, just because I'm beautiful, then I deserve to sort of be a hero. And that really comes back fatally or tragically for her, because she realizes, she kind of comes up against some really real legit hurdles where she realizes, especially with Rodolphe in the end, just being like, I don't care how beautiful you are, I'm not giving you any money. I don't have any money. And so she really actually crumbles under the weight of the real world, because she's unable to kind of maintain this delusion. I think it's interesting, or again, I reading it back, obviously books around that time explored infidelity for the wife as a sort of means of liberation outside of, the strict confines of conjugal love. But I feel like it's a little bit hard, especially reading it backwards now, because it doesn't necessarily hit for us how revolutionary it was to have that. But I found that was a little bit of a conflict with myself. I was like, you kind of... Nowadays, I suppose we're a little bit more conditioned to either immediately writing off characters who are going to have an affair as just being kind of weak-willed or whatever, or if they do have the affair, it's sort of always like a tragedy or a tragic flaw. It's really quite hard to find a character who has an affair where you actually believe that their affair was justified. And I guess now's as good enough a time as any to talk about Stoner by John Williams. So I did talk about Stoner, and I have made a video about it. I really loved Stoner, and I think that it's one of 2 or 3 novels that is perfectly written. And in that book as well, it's almost like, if I was to give an elevator pitch for Stoner, I would say it's Madame Bovary, but Charles has the affair instead of Emma. And it's hard because on the one hand, I'm trying to face or think, is there a double standard that I myself as a man am embodying because, I feel like William or Stoner's affair in that book was more justified than Emma's in this one. But then I also feel like the character of Stoner and his justification for sort of having the affair is a lot more fleshed out. And of course, Stoner was written in the context of having read Madame Bovary. And so, of course, it's hard to compare them. But I was just thinking about, again, when you're writing a novel, you don't necessarily need to have a strict dictatorial voice of saying, this person is so bad for having the affair, which I feel like that is actually what Flaubert did. He almost really indulges in the death and the kind of decay of Emma by the end of the book. Whereas in Stoner, even though it's still such an obvious flaw in Stoner that he has an affair with his wife, it's the way that it's set up makes you kind of buy it a little bit more. But I still think that nowadays, even reading Stoner, there can be a sort of sour taste in your mouth where it just instantly, you kind of write the character off for having an affair. Anyway, I'll just quickly take a look at my notes, a couple of things before I read some extracts. This is something I love. There's a conversation where Homai is talking with a priest, and that's another thing, like another, again, framing Emma's tragedy around men, is that after she is dead, the priest and the apothecary, or the Homai, her neighbor, is sitting there having just this big old conversation, this argument, and that's just another idea of kind of framing and contextualizing Emma's death around like the patriarch and masculine society. But there's this great insult that I really think needs to come back in culture, which is you godless man. It's just it showed up in this book, and weirdly enough, it's even showed up in the book that I'm reading right now. Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride. Sorry, I mispronounced your name when I first talked about it, but I'll make sure I do it right when I do a review on that book. But yeah, you godless man. What a great insult. We need to bring that back. And so let's get started. I think the last thing I have to talk about is, or I wanted to do, is just read a couple of extracts to talk about how good Flaubert's prose is, and to give you a taste of what it was like in this translation. And yeah, so this is a great way of Flaubert just describing or conveying just how mediocre Charles is. Poor Charles. By sheer hard work, he always stayed at about the middle of the class. This is something I love. This is another thing that just attracted me about Flaubert's writing, is I really love when he brings this kind of pleasant grotesqueness. So the scene that they're describing is Charles and Emma's wedding, and he's talking about the guests who, and he's kind of drawing attention to the fact that in their excitement they shaved, or like they prepared and groomed themselves for the wedding, and they had all these cuts on their face. And I'll just read the writing. Every head of hair was freshly clipped, ears were sticking out, cheeks were close-shaven. Some there were who had left their beds before dawn, when there was scarcely enough light to be using a razor, and now had great diagonal gashes across their upper lip, or along the jaw, flaps of detached skin as big as a 3-franc piece, inflamed by the fresh air along the way, so that all those great white beaming faces were blotched with bits of pink. And again, I can really get why Flaubert himself had this sort of manifesto of looking for the right word. It does seem like, again, despite having personal reservations against certain characters' choices, I just can't, like, this might be another one of those books that I can't really imagine needing to be written differently, or not being perfectly written. Here's just a nice descriptive sentence of talking about the inner loneliness and the boredom of Emma in the early days. But this life of hers was as cold as an attic that looks north, and boredom, quiet as a spider, was spinning its web in the shadowy places of her heart. This is something that Homai says in his conversation, actually just one in response to being called a godless man. And this was where I felt like I was getting Flaubert's sort of author voice, his biased author voice coming in, which I love. I love whenever you have that kind of author surrogate character coming in. because the priest says, "You have no religion," and Homai says, "I do have a religion, my religion, and I have rather more than that with their jiggery pokery. I'm the one who worships God. I believe in the supreme being, in a creator, whoever he may be, I care not, who has put us on earth to do our duty as citizens and fathers. But I don't need to go to church and kiss a lot of silver plate, paying out for a bunch of clowns who eat better than we do. You can honor him just as well in the woods, in the fields, and even contemplating the ethereal vault, like the ancients. My God is the God of Socrates, of Franklin, of Voltaire and Berenger. I'm one for the creed of Savoyard Curate and the immortal principles of 89. I cannot, therefore, abide an old fogey of a god who walks around his garden with a stick in his hand, lodges his friends in the bellies of whales, dies with a loud cry, and comes back to life 3 days later. Things absurd in themselves and completely opposed. What is more, to every law of physics, it all shows, incidentally, that the priests have always wallowed in squalid ignorance, doing their utmost to engulf the population among them. To engulf the population along with them. Eat it up, Flaubert. Just go for it. And Emma thinking about the picturesque notion of what falling in love would be and why marriage is so underwhelming. In context of having read all of those fantasy or like romance books. As for Emma, she never once questioned herself to see if she loved him. Love, she believed, had to come suddenly with a great clap of thunder and a lightning flash, a tempest from heaven that falls upon your life like a devastation, scatters your ideals and like leaves and hurls your very soul into the abyss. Little did she know that up on the roof of the house, the rain will form a pool if the gutters are blocked, and there she would have stayed feeling safe inside until one day she suddenly discovered the crack right down the wall. And Flaubert as well talked about how he wanted his first book, when he was talking to his friends about Madame Bovary, he wanted his first book to be like a thunderclap. One more extract. This is from near the end, where she's really just talking about her hysteria or her nervous ailment. No matter, she was not happy, had never been so. Where did it come from, this feeling of deprivation, this instantaneous decay of the things in which she put her trust? But if there were somewhere a strong and beautiful creature, a valiant nature full of passion and delicacy in equal measure, the heart of a poet in the figure of an angel, a lyre with strings of steel, sounding to the skies, elegiac epithalamia, why would she not, fortuitously, find such a one? What an impossibility! Nothing, anyway, was worth that great quest. It was all lies. Every smile concealed the yawn of boredom, every joy a malediction, every satisfaction brought its nausea, and even the most perfect kisses only leave upon the lips a fantastical craving for the supreme pleasure. So, despite the fact that my poor boy Charles suffered so much, I love you so much, Charles, and Emma is terrible, I think the book is brilliant and I think it's worth reading. So thank you again for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.